In the vast theater of World War II, where nations clashed and millions perished, there emerged a story so profound, so defiant, that it would echo through generations. This is the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, the legendary Red Tails, and how they transformed mockery into respect, prejudice into admiration, and doubt into undeniable proof of excellence. Our story begins not in the skies over Europe, but in the segregated American South, in a small town called Tuskegee, Alabama. The year was 1941, and America stood on the precipice of war. But even as the nation prepared to fight tyranny abroad, it maintained a cruel system of racial segregation at home, a system that declared African Americans unfit for combat roles, particularly in the elite world of aviation. The prevailing belief among military leadership was simple and devastating. Black men lacked the intelligence, courage, and reflexes necessary to pilot complex aircraft. They could serve, yes, as cooks, as laborers, as support staff, but never as pilots, never as equals in the sky. This belief was about to be challenged. Under pressure from civil rights organizations and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, the War Department reluctantly established an experimental program, the training of African American pilots at Tuskegee Army Airfield. It was designed, many believed, to fail. To prove once and for all that integration of the military was impossible, that segregation was not just policy, but natural order. The men who arrived at Tuskegee knew they carried more than their own dreams. They carried the hopes of millions. They understood that every mistake would be magnified, every failure used as evidence against their entire race. The pressure was suffocating, impossible, and yet they persevered. Under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who would later become the first African American general in the United States Air Force, these men trained with an intensity born of necessity. They flew obsolete aircraft. They endured harassment from white officers and townspeople. They studied by candlelight when the power was mysteriously cut to their barracks, and they excelled. By 1943, the first squadrons of Tuskegee Airmen were deployed to North Africa, then Italy. They flew the P-40 Warhawk initially, a capable but outdated fighter. Later, they would transition to the P-47 Thunderbolt, and finally to the aircraft that would make them famous, the P-51 Mustang, with its distinctive red-painted tail, a marking that would become their calling card, their warning, and ultimately, their legend. But respect did not come easily, not from their own military, which often assigned them to less prestigious missions, and certainly not from their enemy. German pilots, members of the vaunted Luftwaffe, had heard whispers about these new American flyers. Intelligence reports filtered through the ranks. American Negro pilots, they said, with red tails on their Mustangs. The reaction among many German aces was something between amusement and disbelief. Picture the scene. A Luftwaffe briefing room somewhere in northern Italy, early 1944. Battle-hardened pilots, men who had fought over Britain, Russia, and North Africa, gathering for their daily intelligence update. The briefing officer mentions the new American squadron, the all-black unit. Laughter ripples through the room. "Schwarze Flieger," one pilot says, using the German word for black flyers. "The Americans must be desperate indeed. They must have run out of real pilots," another jokes. "Perhaps we should paint targets on our aircraft to make it easier for them," suggests a third, to more laughter. This mockery wasn't unique to the Germans. It reflected a broader prejudice that crossed national boundaries. The assumption was simple. These pilots would be easy prey, inexperienced, poorly trained, perhaps even cowardly when faced with true combat. The Luftwaffe pilots were in for a brutal awakening. The first encounters were shocking. The Red Tails flew differently than other American squadrons. While many escort fighters would break formation to chase German fighters and rack up kills, abandoning the bombers they were meant to protect, the Tuskegee Airmen stuck to their mission with unwavering discipline. Their job was bomber escort, and they took it seriously, fanatically so. When German fighters attempted their standard tactics, feinting attacks to draw away the escorts before swooping in on the vulnerable bombers, the Red Tails didn't bite. They stayed close. Dangerously close. Some bomber crews initially complained that the Mustangs with red tails flew so near that mid-air collisions seemed inevitable. But those bomber crews quickly learned something. When the red tails escorted you, you came home. The German pilots began to notice. The easy prey they had anticipated fought with skill and ferocity. More than that, they fought with a discipline that bordered on obsession. These weren't glory seekers trying to become aces. These were protectors, guardians who seemed to take personal offense at any threat to their charges. Captain Lee Archer, one of the Tuskegee Airmen, would later recall an engagement over Austria. His squadron was escorting B-17 flying fortresses deep into enemy territory when a group of Messerschmitt Bf-109s attacked. The standard German tactic was to scatter the escorts, but Archer and his wingmen refused to break formation. They came at us from above, Archer remembered, diving fast, firing as they came. But we knew our job. We turned into them, drove them off, then immediately returned to the bombers. They tried again, and again. Each time, we were there. The engagement lasted nearly 20 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat. When it was over, 2 German fighters were smoking toward the earth, and every single bomber in the formation made it home. Not one lost, not one damaged beyond repair. Stories like this began to circulate among Luftwaffe units. The red-tailed Mustangs were no joke. They were, in fact, among the most dangerous opponents in the sky, not because they were the most aggressive, but because they were the most disciplined, because they couldn't be baited, because they put mission above glory. A German pilot named Franz Stigler, who would later become famous for his act of mercy in escorting a damaged American bomber to safety, encountered the red tails several times. In interviews decades later, he spoke with grudging respect about them. "We learned quickly," Stigler said, "that the pilots with the red tails were no different than any other American pilots. Actually, they were perhaps more dedicated. They would not leave their bombers. Ever. This made them very dangerous, because you could not separate them from their charges." The mockery ceased. In its place came wariness, respect, and eventually for some, admiration. But the transformation of attitudes among German pilots came with blood and fire. Combat over Europe was brutal, merciless. The Tuskegee Airmen lost men, good men, skilled pilots who had beaten the odds just to earn their wings. Each loss was a tragedy that resonated far beyond the squadron. When Lieutenant Robert Dees was shot down over Germany, the grief in the squadron was palpable. Dees had been one of the originals, a man who had endured every insult, every obstacle, to reach the cockpit of a fighter plane. His wingman, Lieutenant Harold Brown, later wrote in his diary, "We lost Bobby today. The Germans got him over Frankfurt. I promised myself I would make them pay, not out of hate, but so that his sacrifice means something. And they did make them pay. Not through reckless revenge, but through professional excellence." The statistics began to tell a story that no amount of prejudice could ignore. The 332nd Fighter Group, the unit designation for the Tuskegee Airmen, flew over 15,000 sorties and 1,500 missions. They destroyed 261 enemy aircraft. They damaged countless others. They obliterated ground targets, disrupted supply lines, and supported ground operations. But here's the statistic that mattered most. They never lost a bomber to enemy fighters under their escort. Not one. This claim has been debated by historians. Some records suggest a handful of bombers may have been lost on missions where red tails provided escort. But what's undeniable is that the Tuskegee Airmen had the best protection record of any fighter group in the war. Bomber crews specifically requested them. The phrase "red tail angels" emerged among grateful B-17 and B-24 crews who knew that those red-painted fighters meant they had a fighting chance to see home again. For German pilots, encountering the red tails became an increasingly grim prospect. By late 1944 and early 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons. Experienced pilots were dead or reassigned. Green recruits were thrown into combat with minimal training. The appearance of any American fighters was bad news, but the red tails had earned a particular reputation. A Luftwaffe report from March 1945, discovered after the war, included this notation. Enemy fighters with red tail markings show exceptional aggressiveness in bomber protection role. Recommend avoiding engagement when possible and seeking alternative targets. This was the Luftwaffe, the once mighty German Air Force that had terrorized Europe, recommending their pilots avoid engagement with the very men they had mocked just months earlier. Let that sink in. The transformation wasn't universal, of course. Prejudice is a stubborn thing, resistant to facts and evidence. Some German pilots, steeped in Nazi racial ideology, refused to acknowledge the skill of their adversaries. Some American officers, even as they watched the Tuskegee Airmen compile their remarkable record, continued to believe that black men were inherently inferior. But in the sky, over the battlefields of Europe, a different truth was being written. One measured in bullet holes and empty seats in bomber formations, or rather, the lack thereof when the Red Tails flew escort. Second Lieutenant Charles Dryden, another Tuskegee Airman, described a mission where his formation encountered a squadron of Focke-Wulf FW-190s, some of Germany's best fighters, flown by some of their best pilots. They came at us with confidence, Dryden recalled, but we had something they didn't. We had something to prove, not just to them, but to our own country. Every mission was about showing the world what we could do. So we fought like men possessed. The engagement was fierce. Dryden's wingman took hits but stayed in formation. Another pilot, Lieutenant Roscoe Brown, downed a FW-190 with a deflection shot that other pilots called impossible. When it was over, the bombers continued to their target unmolested. Mission accomplished. But Dryden's words hint at something deeper, the psychological dimension of the Red Tails' success. These men weren't just fighting the Luftwaffe. They were fighting centuries of prejudice, generations of being told they were inferior. Every mission was a referendum on their humanity. Every victory was a blow against racism itself. The German pilots who mocked them couldn't understand this dimension. They saw adversaries in the sky, threats to be eliminated. They didn't understand that the Red Tails carried a weight far heavier than ammunition and fuel. They carried the hopes of millions of African Americans who saw in their success a promise that change was possible. As the war ground toward its conclusion, with Germany collapsing and Allied forces advancing from all directions, the reputation of the Tuskegee Airmen had been firmly established. They had flown some of the longest and most dangerous missions of the war. They had protected bombers attacking targets deep in the heart of the Third Reich. They had fought the best the Luftwaffe had to offer and emerged victorious more often than not. In the final months of the war, a remarkable incident occurred that highlighted how far the Red Tails' reputation had spread. A formation of B-17s found itself under attack by German jets, the new Messerschmitt Me-262s, revolutionary aircraft that were faster than anything the Allies could field. These jets were wreaking havoc on bomber formations, their speed making them nearly impossible to intercept. Nearly impossible. 3 Red Tails, pilots whose names would become legend, Roscoe Brown, Charles Brantley, and Earl Lane, engaged the jets. Against all odds, against aircraft that should have been untouchable, they scored kills. Brown shot down one Me-262. Lane damaged another so severely it had to break off the attack. Brantley drove off 2 more. The bombers survived. A captured German pilot, questioned after the war, was asked about his experience fighting the Americans. He spoke of the day his Me-262, the Luftwaffe's supposed wonder weapon, was shot down by a red-tailed Mustang. "I thought I was safe," he said. The 262 was so much faster. But the American pilot, I learned later he was a Schwarze, a Negro. He predicted where I would be. He didn't chase me. He waited for me to come to him. When I passed, his bullets found me. My engine failed. I barely escaped with my life. He paused, then added, I had heard jokes about the Negro pilots. After that day, I never laughed at those jokes again. This gradual erosion of mockery, this transformation from derision to respect, happened in countless small moments over the course of the war. German pilots learned, often fatally, that the color of a man's skin had nothing to do with his ability to fight, to fly, to kill. The irony is bitter and profound. Nazi Germany, built on a foundation of racial supremacy, sent pilots into the sky who were forced to confront the lie at the heart of their ideology. The Tuskegee Airmen, fighting for a country that denied them basic civil rights, proved through their excellence that racism was not just morally wrong, but factually absurd. But let's not romanticize this too much. The respect earned by the Tuskegee Airmen in combat did not immediately translate to respect at home. When they returned to America after the war, they came back to a segregated society. They couldn't eat in the same restaurants as white Americans, couldn't attend the same schools, couldn't vote in many states, couldn't live in the same neighborhoods. Some red tails, still in uniform, decorated with medals earned in combat, were refused service at restaurants, were forced to the back of buses, were beaten by police for the crime of being black in public. The German pilots who had learned to respect them had done so only because the red tails had proven themselves in the most brutal way possible, through combat. They had earned respect through excellence under fire because no other path was open to them. This is both the triumph and the tragedy of their story. The triumph is undeniable. The Tuskegee Airmen shattered myths. They proved that ability transcends race. They flew with distinction and honor. They saved countless lives. They earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, 744 Air Medals, and 8 Purple Hearts. 3 of their number received the Medal of Honor, though these awards came decades late in 2007, long after the war had ended and many of the recipients had died. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., their commander, would eventually achieve the rank of 4-star general. The first African American to do so, their legacy influenced President Harry Truman's decision to desegregate the military in 1948, a landmark moment in the civil rights movement. Their story inspired generations of African Americans to pursue careers in aviation and the military. But the tragedy is equally clear. These men should never have had to prove themselves. Their humanity should have been self-evident. The fact that they needed to compile a perfect record, to be twice as good as white pilots just to be considered equal, reveals the deep sickness at the heart of American society at the time. And the German pilots who mocked them? Many would return to Germany after the war and rebuild their lives. Some wrote memoirs. Some gave interviews. A few expressed regret about their initial prejudice when encountering the red tails. Most simply acknowledged that they had been excellent pilots and dangerous opponents. Franz Stiegler, the German pilot mentioned earlier, eventually moved to Canada and became friends with Charles Charlie Brown, the American bomber pilot he had escorted to safety in an extraordinary act of humanity during the war. In their many conversations, Stiegler spoke about the red tails. They were warriors, Stiegler said simply. Perhaps the best we faced. Not because they scored the most kills, but because they understood what mattered. They understood duty, honor, sacrifice. They had nothing to prove to us. We should have had nothing to prove to them. We were all just trying to survive. This, perhaps, is the final transformation. The recognition that shared humanity transcends national and racial boundaries. That in the end, they were all pilots, all warriors, all human beings caught in the machinery of war. But we should not allow this universal humanism to obscure the specific injustice the Tuskegee Airmen faced. They were fighting 2 wars, one against Nazi Germany and one against American racism. German pilots eventually respected them because they had no choice. The red tails forced that respect at gunpoint in the sky, where prejudice couldn't hide from reality. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen extends far beyond their combat record. They became symbols of the civil rights movement. Their story was taught in schools, told in books and films. The Red Tail Angels entered American mythology as proof that integration could work, that Black Americans could excel in any field given the opportunity. In 2007, President George W. Bush awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen collectively. Hundreds of aging veterans, some in their 80s and 90s, gathered in the Capitol Rotunda for the ceremony. Many wept. Some embraced former white bomber crew members who credited the Red Tails with saving their lives. It was a moment of recognition, of validation, that came far too late for many of the original airmen who had already passed away. But for those who remained, it was acknowledgement that their service mattered, that their excellence had not been forgotten. Today, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen is taught as a triumph. And it is. But we must remember that it's a triumph that was necessary only because of injustice. That they should never have had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. That the German pilots who mocked them were wrong, but so were the American officers who doubted them, and so was the entire system of segregation that tried to keep them out of the cockpit in the first place. The transformation from mockery to respect is a powerful narrative. It shows that excellence cannot be denied forever. That ability will out, even in the face of overwhelming prejudice. That determined individuals can break barriers and change minds. But let's be clear about what it took. Incredible courage, extraordinary skill, inhuman pressure and blood. The Tuskegee Airmen paid for respect with their lives. They earned it in the most hostile environment imaginable, in combat, where mistakes are fatal. Some never made it home. Their planes were shot down over Germany, Italy, France. Their bodies were never recovered. Their families received telegrams that began with the words every family dreaded. The War Department regrets to inform you. These men died proving what should never have needed proof, that Black Americans were equal to white Americans, that courage and skill know no color, that racism is a lie. The German pilots who initially mocked them learned this lesson. Some learned it by being shot down by the very men they had dismissed. Some learned it by watching their carefully orchestrated attacks fall apart against the disciplined defense of the Red Tails. Some learned it simply by surviving and paying attention. And what they learned, they remembered. In the decades after the war, as Germany reckoned with its Nazi past and America reckoned with its racist present, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen stood as a powerful counter-narrative to racial theories that had caused so much destruction. In the end, the transformation from mockery to respect was never really about changing German minds. It was about forcing the world to recognize a truth that should have been self-evident, that human dignity and capability are not determined by race. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't just fight in World War II. They fought in the longer war for civil rights, for equality, for justice. Their victories in the sky over Europe were important, but their victory over prejudice, incomplete and ongoing as it remains, may be their most significant contribution. When we tell the story of how German pilots mocked the Red Tails and then learned to respect them, we're really telling a story about the power of excellence to overcome prejudice, about how courage and skill can force recognition even from enemies, about how men who were given every reason to fail instead chose to soar. The Red Tails were more than pilots. They were pioneers. They were warriors. They were living proof that the American promise of equality was possible, even if it remained unfulfilled in their lifetimes. Their red-painted tails became symbols, warnings to enemies, reassurance to allies, and hope to millions of Americans who saw in those crimson markings a promise that change was coming, that barriers could be broken, that the future would be different than the past. The German pilots who mocked them were wrong, but they learned. Sometimes that learning came too late, in the final seconds before their aircraft plummeted to Earth, shot down by the very pilots they had dismissed. The Tuskegee Airmen forced that learning. They demanded respect. They earned it. And they did so not through anger or violence for its own sake, but through professional excellence and unwavering dedication to their mission. This is their legacy. Red tails in the sky, protecting bombers, defying expectations, proving that courage knows no color and excellence needs no excuse. They were the Red Tails. They were the Tuskegee Airmen. And they were, quite simply, among the finest pilots to ever take to the sky. Their story reminds us that progress often comes at great cost, that barriers fall not through wishes but through the determined efforts of brave individuals willing to risk everything to prove what should never have needed proving. The German pilots learned to respect them. America learned to respect them. And in that hard-won respect lies a lesson for all of us. That prejudice is not just wrong but foolish. That excellence transcends barriers. And that human dignity cannot be denied forever, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against it. The engines of their Mustangs are silent now. The men who flew them are nearly all gone, passing into history. But their legacy remains, in every barrier broken, every assumption challenged, every person who looks at the sky and sees not limits, but possibility. They were mocked, they were doubted, they were underestimated, and they flew anyway. They flew with red tails gleaming in the sun, guardians of the sky, protectors of the bombers, and pioneers of a better future. This is their story, a story of mockery transformed into respect, of prejudice overcome through excellence, of men who refused to be defined by others' limitations and instead wrote their own legend in the skies over Europe. The Red Tails, forever remembered, forever honored, forever flying in our memory.